So we've, of course, been talking a lot about the playoffs lately, but let's talk about some offseason trade stuff, too. One, because it's good for viewership. And two, because we've got some really interesting stuff happening in Atlanta. Because even before recent events, we all kind of felt like there was going to be some changes for the Hawks this offseason. DeJounte Murray, Clint Capella, whatever the case may be. Then we're getting reports over the last couple of days about how they're much more likely to trade Trae Young away than a lot of people first considered. And then they went ahead and got the first overall pick in the draft. Now, granted, it's not a very strong draft, and it's a draft lottery that I don't think a lot of people paid attention to. But still, first overall pick is a big deal, and I think changes a lot of things in terms of the outlook for Atlanta. And I think it is very, very, very likely that Trae Young ends up on a different basketball team this offseason. There's some super interesting trade destinations for him as well. First, let's talk about the Lakers. Now, before we go through, you can go ahead and see the trade and yell and scream about it. Before we go through all the trades, Trae Young's value as an individual trade asset is unbelievably difficult to figure out because he's very talented, but he's on a big contract, and there's a lot of controversy around the league and with other fans about how much value he actually provides. So these trades are a structure that could potentially maybe sort of kind of make sense. The contracts make sense. There's draft picks involved. If you think Trae Young is more or less valuable than some of the trades we talk about today, that's fine. I can promise you that there are just as many people on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of their opinion on Trae Young's trade value. So take these more as a conversation piece than me saying this is exactly what Trae Young's individual value is to each of these teams, because it is going to be a sliding scale. This trade structure would be, the contract stuff with Lakers is a little bit weird, but it would be D'Angelo Russell, Rui, Gabe Vincent, Hood Schifino, and a 2025 first round pick from the Lakers in exchange for Trae Young. Now, the reason that Trae Young would make sense for the Lakers is because they're just going to go back to this star model, right? Like, they want to go back to having their three stars. They tried it with Russ. They tried it with a variety of different guys. And assuming that LeBron stays, which is a big part of this, assuming that LeBron stays, either opts in or signs a new contract with the Lakers, adding Trae Young to that core of LeBron and AD is extremely helpful for them because they need that offensive punch. They're relying on D'Angelo Russell. They're relying on Austin Reeves, who are fine players. But at the end of the day, sometimes you need someone that's going to create more on the level of someone like Trae Young, especially if either LeBron is hurt or he's a little bit tired in a postseason game. He's 40 years old, all that stuff, right? For Atlanta, this would all be about getting some salary cap space, or getting some salary cap relief, I should say, because Trae Young's contract is worth over $40 million for the next handful of seasons. And that's going to be a big part of a lot of these trades because they have the opportunity to really break down their team and get a lot of stuff in exchange, starting here, of course, with Trae Young. They could reroute, the D'Angelo Russell contracts, the Rui contracts. They could get some stuff for those guys, and they get a 2025 first, and you just never know with the Lakers in terms of what exactly that is going to be worth. I do think that this is going to be a team that Atlanta negotiates with, that they have conversations with. I don't think it's the most likely Trae Young destination, but this is something similar to what it would look like. Now, the problem in terms of the trade structure is that the Lakers need to match Trae Young's $40+ million salary, and they've got a handful of contracts that just make this a little bit weird. Like, it would be most likely D'Lo. And then the other ones are kind of hard to figure out. Like, you've got Rui, you've got Austin Reeves, you got Gabe Vincent, you got Vanderbilt. And I think Hood Schifino is probably in the deal just to give the Hawks some young talent back. But you got to figure out some combination of those other, $12 to $20 million players. Obviously D'Lo going to be in it. Is Reeves going to be in it? Is Jared Vanderbilt going to be in it? Is Rui going to be in it? How exactly do they make those structures work? And how much are those players valued by Atlanta or by other teams potentially in a third team structure? So the Lakers had to be mentioned here. I think it's an interesting spot. But the next team I think is actually more likely in terms of a Trae Young destination. And that team is the San Antonio Spurs. Now, the reason that I mention them as a Trae Young destination and the reason that I think that is relatively likely that he ends up in San Antonio has everything to do with the assets that San Antonio has. Because in a theoretical universe, you can see the trade here, in a theoretical universe in which the Hawks start trading stuff away, right? They trade away Bogdanovich. They trade away Clint Capella. They trade away maybe DeJounte Murray down the road. They trade away Trae Young. The reason for that would be, one, to reset the roster, get cheaper, get these young guys, take someone with the first overall pick. And also the reason would be to be bad and to get high picks in the future. Problem is, they owe a team, in this case, the Spurs, some of their future first round picks. And so that strategy is much less valuable if you don't have your own picks. And so if you're Atlanta and you're looking at restructuring the roster this offseason and that beginning by trading away Trae Young, the best thing you could do would be to get your own picks back. They ironically owe those picks as a result of the DeJounte Murray trade, DeJounte Murray still being on the roster. The best thing that Atlanta could do if they're trading away Trae Young is to get their picks back, presuming that they want to trade all these pieces away and be bad and try and rebuild the roster. Which leads us to the trade structure of Zach Collins, Devontae Graham, a couple of Atlanta picks back, one being a swap, and then a 2025 first from Chicago as well that San Antonio also has the rights to. Now, obviously, Players in this trade, not super impactful, mostly here to give the Hawks some salary cap relief. The Spurs are in a nice situation, as are one of the other teams that we're going to talk about here later, because they can just take on some of Trae Young's salary, and thus Atlanta doesn't have to take back as much money because they can just absorb the contract into their salary cap space. And San Antonio adds something that they desperately need on their roster, which is a perimeter creator alongside Victor Wembanyama. Their guard backcourt creator situation all season long was terrible. It was really, really tough to watch. And importantly, in this structure, they keep Keldon Johnson, they keep Devin Vassell, they keep Sohan, like they keep all the other pieces that can not only work well moving forward in the future with Wembanyama, but also provide a defensive infrastructure around Trae Young that you're going to need in order to make this work. Now, personally, on the Spurs, I wouldn't really want Trae Young. I'm not a huge Trae Young guy, but there's been reports and rumors going back 6 months about the fact that they are interested in trading for him. And if I'm Atlanta and I want to try and trade away all this stuff and be bad, the first team I'm calling about a Trae Young trade, and I'd be willing to take a little bit less from San Antonio than I would from other teams, because those picks are more valuable to me than they are to anybody else. Like those Hawks picks are nice for the Spurs, but they're more valuable to Atlanta than any other team. And even if in terms of the level of value, I'm taking a little bit less from San Antonio, I'd still rather work with them because of the value of those picks if they reset and rebuild the entire roster. Now, if they just want to flip Trae Young into some stuff and then run it back with DeJounte Murray and the other veterans on the roster, then that's a different equation. But assuming they want to do the smart thing, trade everyone away, build around the first pick, build around Jalen Johnson, then I'd want these picks back. Another team that I think is going to be very involved and is very interesting here are the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, you can see the structure on the screen. It's a little bit weird to work out some of the salary stuff in the offseason because you don't know what teams are going to do in terms of free agency and cap holds and things like that. So I put two other players on there, mostly just as a way to kind of even that stuff out a little bit. You can talk about the value of that if you'd like to, but essentially the core of the trade is Brandon Ingram for Trae Young. Now, Brandon Ingram is a 2025 free agent. So if you're Atlanta, you're trading for him, that's a big concern. You want to make sure that you have an understanding with Brandon Ingram of what the contract looks like and what the extension looks like when you trade for him, because you're not going to trade away Trae Young for a guy that's just going to leave in 2025. But theoretically, again, when you go back to that scenario, trading stuff away, getting picks, being bad, Brandon Ingram is a really nice piece to have if you're Atlanta, because he is a legitimate, really, really good scorer, right? And then you have all these other young pieces. You have Onyeka Okongwu, you have Jalen Johnson, you have whoever you pick with the first overall pick. And then you start to build a team that's pretty interesting as you continue to add assets from other trades on the roster. And that, to me, is a structure that makes a decent amount of sense for Atlanta. Again, assuming they can re-sign Brandon Ingram and keep him beyond the summer of 2025, and assuming that they are okay with the timeline of Ingram along with Jalen Johnson and Okongwu and whoever they draft with the first overall pick. Now, for New Orleans, this gets a little bit weird because you still have CJ McCollum and defensive structures that involve Trae Young and CJ McCollum together at once don't necessarily seem ideal to me defensively, but maybe this is an opportunity for them to move on from CJ, whatever the case may be. I put this trade in there because I'm just very, very aware of possible Brandon Ingram trades right now in terms of the offseason for New Orleans. And if it involves a guard upgrade within that structure, which I think Trae Young certainly is a guard upgrade over CJ McCollum, then I think it's a deal that makes a ton of sense for them. We talked about this in other videos. If Zion's healthy and he's who he was the last couple of months of the year, then I want Herb Jones, I want Trey Murphy, I want Zion, I want those guys out there. I want to figure it out at the 5 spot. And if they add someone like Trae Young in there, that's fantastic. Like if they could figure out a way to do this deal, get Trae Young and Clint Capella or something along with those 3 guys on the wings, that's a really, really interesting team in New Orleans. And you can say what you want about Trae Young as a player overall, but certainly for New Orleans would represent an upgrade in the backcourt despite having to trade away a significant asset here in Brandon Ingram. Another team I want to mention here, nobody freak out. It's just Ben Simmons. Relax. He's not actually there. It's just his salary. Relax. The Brooklyn Nets, okay? This would be Ben Simmons, Dariq Whitehead, and 2 first-round picks, both of which from Phoenix, with various protections on them in exchange for Trae Young. Now, the reasoning for this for Brooklyn is pretty similar to the way it is for New Orleans, where they are just trying to find a guard. Like, they desperately need some kind of creator on the roster, and really, that's the theme for a lot of these teams that are potentially trading for Trae Young is like they're one of the handful of teams in the league, not many, but a handful of teams in the league that need that kind of an upgrade. They need a creator, and obviously Brooklyn is one of those teams. They get rid of the Ben Simmons contract on it expiring, which gives Atlanta a ton of salary cap space release going into the following season. Whitehead is a guy that, could be good, could be not, I don't know. But then you've got these future Phoenix picks as well, which could be extremely valuable if you're Atlanta. This is a relatively clean fit if, again, you are trying to just break things down and rebuild. And whether they would actually look into this, whether they'd actually trade with the Nets, depends on what they could potentially get from other teams. But I think the Nets are certainly in a position where they need to be better this coming season. They need to be better, certainly offensively. And if some of the other potential stars out there, namely Donovan Mitchell, aren't realistic for them to acquire, I think Trae Young would be an interesting plan B in Brooklyn even though I'm sure Hawks fans wouldn't be very excited about this particular package. Speaking of teams that need guard help, we got to talk about the Orlando Magic here as well. Now, this one's a little bit weird because these teams play each other a ton. They're in the same division, but this would be Anthony Black, Jed Howard, and a first-round pick, 2024 first-round pick from Orlando in exchange for Trae Young. Now, probably you had to throw some more draft compensation in there. Like I said, these are just some structures of trades. It's not exactly perfect, right? But again, similar to how San Antonio was earlier, the nice thing here for Atlanta is they don't really get big contracts back. Like, they get 2 rookie-scale contracts and a first-round pick in exchange for Trae Young because Orlando has the salary cap space to bring in a salary of that magnitude, although obviously that limits what Orlando can then do in free agency afterwards because it takes up so much of their salary cap space. But essentially, this is 3 first-round picks in exchange for Trae Young. You've got the 2 guys that you drafted last year in the first round in the lottery, and then you have Orlando's first-round pick this year. Like, 3 first-round picks in exchange for Trae Young, and you don't have to take back basically any salary if you were the Hawks. That's the rationale for them. For Orlando, they, again, just like San Antonio, just like Brooklyn, just like New Orleans, like, they need help at the guard spots. They need a creator. They need a guy that they can give 50 possessions a game to. And Trae Young, whatever you want to say about him defensively or you know, the way that he works offensively, he's definitely one of those guys, and he's definitely extremely talented and would be an upgrade, a significant upgrade for Orlando. Now, you could argue a couple of things here. Or either you could argue that Orlando would have to put Franz Wagner in the trade. I don't think that's the case at all. Or you could argue, as I have in the past, that Orlando doesn't necessarily need another, you know, star alongside Franz and Paolo. Like, they're good in terms of creation with those 2 guys. What they need is spacing. What they need is shooting. They don't need another guy that's just going to take the ball down the floor every single time and creating ball screens the way that Trae would. 2 sides of that coin. One, Trae with either Paolo or Franz setting him a screen would be a really interesting offensive construct for the Magic to kind of take advantage of. Whereas on the other hand, Trae Young as an off-ball spacer isn't exactly fantastic. Like, when you look at some of his shooting numbers, if you go into some of the advanced stuff like off-ball, he's been fine, but he's not someone that typically works off-ball a ton. And for a team in Orlando that really needs off-ball spacing, you could argue that Trae isn't a fantastic fit. But those, to me, those are the top 5 teams that I'd be looking at. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this in terms of possible reasons for the Hawks to trade away Trae Young in terms of what their future plans would be, what they would be looking to get in return, all that kind of stuff. But this is where I'm at with some of the rumors we're getting right now for Trae Young.